Welcome everyone to today's session of the AI Explained. We will be recording the webinar and it should be available afterwards. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A tab. We will answer them throughout this webinar. So let me start with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Krishnaram Kentapadi. I'm the Chief AI Officer and Chief Scientist at Fiddler AI. As you may all know, Fiddler AI is an enterprise startup building a responsible AI and model monitoring platform. I have been at Fiddler for a little less than a year, and before that I led responsible AI-related initiatives at organizations like LinkedIn machine learning team and later at Amazon's AWS machine learning team. Today, we are really excited to discuss about the recently announced AI Bill of Rights. Joining me today is Merv Haycock, who is an expert in the field. Merv, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, Krishna, and really excited to be here and talk about this recent development, which we consider, one of the greatest AI policy developments in US. So I wear a few hats. One is I'm the founder of AIethicist.org. Within that, focusing on research training and consulting on how to develop, use, and govern AI systems responsibly and ethically. So I do capacity building training and consulting to organizations from startups to public entities. With Center for AI and Digital Policy, I'm the research director at the center. And with the center, we do education, AI policy education, advocacy, and advisory. So we're a global nonprofit, educational nonprofit based in DC. And we have AI policy practitioners, civil society advocates, and academics from 60 countries. And we run AI policy clinics and semester-long training for those, and kind of teaching not only policy research skills, but also some of the AI policy and regulation landscape. And finally, I also teach data science ethics at University of Michigan School of Information. So somehow they all come together, and all my passions come together in this.
Yeah, that's a really amazing background and experience. So maybe before going into the AA Bill of Rights, can you share some thoughts on like what led you to found the AIethicist.org? What is the inspiration to start this organization?
Absolutely, and thank you for giving me the chance. And I do apologize to the audience about this like sunlight right on my face, by the way. That's why I'm like kind of moving every now and then. I have almost 20 years of corporate background. I was a vice president in HR technology for Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So I was responsible for diversity recruitment and recruitment technologies that we used across almost 27 countries and every region outside of US. When I was dealing with those technologies, and back in the time, it wasn't necessarily AI, but more like automated technologies and systems. And I was talking to different group of students, civil society organizations. It came to a point where I had an understanding that if we don't develop these technologies and the processes around this, like the wraparound processes and procedures around this responsibly, and think deeper, we're actually putting more obstacles and barriers in the way of people knowing about these jobs that we're recruiting for, going through the recruitment process, and possibly unintentionally kind of keeping not being inclusive enough in our approaches, because we were spending a crazy amount of time, resources trying to expand our diversity and inclusion efforts, attract students from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and explain what we do within an investment bank. But we were also shooting ourselves in the foot by not thinking more responsibly. So that was for me the impetus to think more about responsible technology. And then I stepped out of, I left the corporate world and founded AIethicist.org to focus more on AI side of things and focus on, kind of stepping away from the HR a bit and looking at the overall picture of like social justice, bias, discrimination, fundamental rights, etc., and one thing led to another.
Yeah, that's really insightful. As you were alluding to, given the wide areas where AI is being applied, there is intrinsically a social and technical components, right? It's not just a technical discipline anymore. There is like so much socio-technical aspects. That's why I think it's really important for all of us to remember that, to bring stakeholders with several different backgrounds together, right? Like and this today's conversation is also fantastic because we have a lot of attendees in our audience who may be more of the ML practitioners, and we have Merv, who brings a very diverse kind of experience to this. So with that, for those who are still catching up, could you shed some light on what prompted the White House Office of Science and Technology to write this blueprint?
Absolutely. I think it's helpful to step back in time to this time, about almost this time last year, where the Office of Science and Technology Policy Director and Deputy Director Dr. Alondra Nelson said some of the failings of AI might be intentional, but they're serious and they're disproportionate enough, and they already affect marginalized individuals and communities. So we need to do something about it. They said Americans have a right to expect better of the systems that they're interacting with, whether that's public or private. And then these technologies should be required, or rather the organizations behind these technologies should be required to respect democratic values and fundamental rights. They also concluded in that announcement that we need a Bill of Rights to guard against these technologies that we've created, and looking at a clear vision of how those Bill of Rights, AI Bill of Rights, should look like. For me, kind of starting from that announcement since last year, there was a very, very clear vision from the very beginning of connecting this to democratic values and fundamental rights and civil rights. Those were the underlying themes of the announcement. They are the underlying themes of the administration. And I think a lot of credit goes to Dr. Nelson and her team on making this initiative in the first place and taking it through and carrying on with that commitment. And I think just as that as the prompt or the rationale for starting this in the first place, but also another historical note. When this was announced, or again this time around last year, Secretary Blinken also had a statement saying, more than anything else, we are looking at we need a compelling vision for how to use technology in a way that serves people, protects our interests and democratic values. And he said, absent a legislative agenda on clear statement of principles, neither internally, domestically in US or our allies have actually a clear understanding of what AI policy objectives are. I think if you look at the overall picture, there was from the very beginning a focus on fundamental rights, democratic values, and having this principled approach as well.
Yeah, really, it's really great to hear some of the origins, right, and how this ties in with democratic values and the values we often take for granted living in a democratic society. So it's great to see that we have some great questions starting to come in already. For all the attendees, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. So will go through them during the course of this webinar. So before going into the questions, so can you maybe provide some insights on what are the key principles? We hear a lot about 5 key principles underlying the AI Bill of Rights. Can you just briefly just walk us through what they are?
Yes, absolutely. And before going into the principles, I think it's helpful to go to the concept of automated systems, because although the title itself says Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, when you actually start reading both the definitions and the principles themselves, the reference is to automated systems. And because there aren't any caveats of how do you say, automated systems, autonomous systems, etc. I think for me the concept, it's a wider conceptualization than AI, like strictly AI and ML, because automated systems might be very basic. It might be legacy systems, but still have the same harmful effects. And or the blueprint, I think, intentionally does not define AI systems as well, which makes it a more flexible, a wider future applied document as well. Having said that, as you mentioned, there are 5 principles, underlying principles that go through the blueprints, which are safe and effective systems, algorithmic discrimination protections, data privacy, notice and explanation, human alternatives, consideration and fallback. We at the center especially are kind of reframing this a bit, these titles at least, to make it more understandable in terms of what they mean. So for example, for algorithmic discrimination protections, referring to fairness, equity, and protection of, anti-protection of civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. For notice and explanation, the principle really refers to transparency and explainability. For human alternatives, consideration and fallback, the underlying concept here is really accountability, how to hold the organizations and people behind it accountable. And if I may, I would like to say a bit of for each of these principles. So for safe and
just to clarify, these are all when we say automated decision-making systems, these are automated decision-making systems that affect people, right? Like if there is an automated decision-making system for, let's say, predictive maintenance of an equipment and so forth, that's not what we are talking about. We are talking about systems that affect people.
Correct. Correct. And an automated in the sense that you might have an automated decision tree, right? It might not be an AI, but you might still have very harmful or discriminatory criteria in it that has the same, how do you say, outcomes. So how do we ensure that all these automated systems, including AI, respect these principles in development, deployment, and governance? So for the first principle, safe and effective systems, what the principle and the practice, like operationalization of it, suggest is really about pre-deployment testing, risk identification, risk mitigation, and ongoing monitoring of risk. And for some of those, subject, being subject to independent evaluation, whether that is independent audits or some sort of assessment, but independent of the developers or users. So it's really about ensuring the systems are safe for those being impacted by the outcomes, and then making sure that the organizations developing, implementing, and governing the systems have in place systems, whether ex ante, post hoc, or ongoing,
Mhm.
risk monitoring systems in place. And I want to underline, especially like, or kind of pull out from the blueprints, that it's not only the developers or developer organizations that they're referring to. There is a very clear reference to developer organizations, um, and implementers and governors, and governance systems. Um, so that's one thing to remember as well. And within this principle, there's also the call about the possibility of not deploying a system. So if you see a risk that you can't mitigate,
Mhm.
or if there is a unacceptable risk to a fundamental right or a civil right or a democratic value, there should be a possibility of not deploying in the first place. The second principle, algorithmic discriminations, like I said, was more about fairness and equity and proactively assessing the outcomes for disparate impact and bias, and making sure that we don't cut people's access or groups' access to resources and opportunities. Uh, Data privacy is respect for privacy and data quality in the first place, but also there's also, if you again read the details in the documents, there's a call out for surveillance practices as well, which I think is pretty strong uh, in its application or in scope. And then the next principle, notice and explanation, is, as I mentioned, is really around transparency and explainability of the systems. So notifying, knowing when there's an actually automated system is in use in the first place, so you can actually do something about it, as react to it. But also explaining the functionality of the systems. Why is the system there in the first place? What it is trying to do, and does it do the objective align with the policy, or the outcomes align with the objective of the system, etc. I think that transparency and explainability are extremely crucial for the next one. Which
So on that note, just a thought. So I think often we may tend to conflate transparency and explainability, but as you alluded to, even informing the users that an automated system is part of the process, right, is making the decision, is often important. People may not even be, say, if you think of lay persons, they may not even be aware that there is a machine learning model making certain decisions, right? Like if say, let's say you apply to some job, and you may not even realize that a machine learning model is looking at the resumes, and or when you apply for a credit, you may think that there is some human making the decision, but in reality it might be all just automated systems.
absolutely, if you don't know, you're not able to react to it. You might be okay with it, but sometimes uh, you might see an unexpected result from the system. You might see a biased or discriminatory result from the system. You don't even have a way of challenging the outcome. You're just subject to the outcome. So that notice, knowing that there's a system in the first place, is the first step towards oversight, accountability, uh, and also improving the system. You don't want to be just making people subject to things, but have that as a collaborative approach as well.
Mhm.
And then the last principle, as the title in the blueprint goes, is human alternatives, consideration, and fallback, which might not be immediately clear what that means, but it's really about accountability and being able to have a human decision-making mechanism in place if for certain systems, obviously not every system, but for certain systems, that you're not only subject to automated system decisions, that there is a review process, that there is that you can challenge the system and see, a human can consider the results and maybe override the results as necessary or correct the system. So um, as five as five principles and the details go, I think those are some of the high level explanations. But like I said, it's important to remember that this is wider. What it is calling for is wider than AI and ML.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a real nice point. And so as you described the five principles, especially the last two, I was reminded of my experience with even hiring systems, right? Especially when I was part of LinkedIn, looking at hiring related algorithms in general. I remember reading from Kathy O'Neill's the book on the weapons of math destruction, that so if you take even hiring related systems, if you are applying for let's say a CXO position or a VP position, chances are that there is a human always reviewing your applications, right? Or if you're applying for $1 million loan, there is chances of that you have access to a domain expert or a human who can review your application. But when it comes to say if you're applying for an entry level position, or if you're applying for a $100 credit, then often you may not even get access to people, right? Like, do you have thoughts on how to reconcile that reality, right? The reality in terms of economics and what is feasible, what is not feasible, with the requirement or the guidance in this fifth, especially the fifth principle.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit it right on the nail. I think these systems don't apply to everyone equally. So as you pointed out, the higher you're in an organization, the more resources that you have, the higher socioeconomic uh, levels that you have, like income you have, etc. You have the luxury to step outside the normal systems or algorithmic systems and have that human element and access to resources and opportunities a lot easier. However, a lot of these systems are brought in for efficiency reasons, right? For mass decisions, which tend to be, and reduce cost, which tend to be those, as you mentioned, entry-level jobs, people reliant on or needing government benefits to continue their life and sustain their lives. People requiring medical assistance or with their disabilities, people require, trying to access more resources because they need it for their to sustain their lives and continue it with their lives. So that group always tends to be, subject to something, subject to mass decisions. And I think with automated systems and AI systems, as we're bringing in efficiency, that always needs to be at the back of our minds, that we don't marginalize and disadvantage the same groups again and again and again, and across the systems as well, because I see these systems converging as well, because it's not one system making an independent standalone decision. We're now seeing the outcomes of one automated system being an input to another one. So it's becoming connected. And if you start disadvantaging a person or a group in one system, you are creating a snowball effect as in other systems as well.
Yes, I think that's kind of to the point that say just left to economics or the market dynamics is not enough, right? Like, that's why we need such guardrails. So talking of guardrails, one of the questions we have from our attendees is, can we discuss the enforcement components of the AA Bill of Rights? And the expectations on timeline for enforcement, if any? Like, first of all, is this even enforceable, or is this just guidelines?
Yes, absolutely. And how it will affect organizations in general, right? Even without the enforcement, what will be the effect? I think since last week, since the launch, I read a lot of criticism about the blueprint and saying it's just another set of principles. It's not going to impact practices. It's not going to really, turn into enforcement. And I disagree with that, and would like to explain why, and as it relates to enforcement as well. First of all, saying that OSTP's work is not enforceable means that maybe we don't clearly understand what OSTP stands for,
Mhm.
and what their mandate is. And so Office of Science and Technology Policy is there to coordinate the federal science and technology policy and then turn around and advise the president with the best possible guidance or advice on policy, on priorities, etc. So by definition, they're part of the executive branch, and their role is about coordinating policy across government agencies, working with the president, working with the Congress, and providing guidance. They don't have mandate to make laws or make legislation or come up with enforcement mechanisms. That sits with the Congress in the U.S. However, I think through that engagement, through that coordination with the agencies, Congress, and the president, um, the legislative agenda becomes clearer
Mm.
and more coordinated. And I think on that note, the OSTP definitely delivered exactly what the mission of the office is. They created principles as they said they would, and they're advising the president on further action. The second piece on the engagement and commitment, if you look at the federal agencies that were both present in the launch, as well as the coordination behind the scenes with the agencies on the creation of the blueprints, there's a lot of organizational commitment. And as it comes to enforcement, some of these agencies have enforcement powers. So I think just by the sheer fact of that engagement and commitments with OSTP and with this blueprint, some of the how do you say, agency priorities might also shift.
Mm.
You make a public commitment, then you turn around and kind of need to deliver on those enforcement commitments as well. Having said that, there's a huge need for Congress to take this into the legislative action and put more power into agencies such as FTC, EEOC, etc., Consumer Protection Board, to either provide them with more resources, clearer mechanisms and forces. So I think there's still work to do around that. But I also, going back to the enforcement, I think the one thing that was interesting was the reports. If you search for 1973 reports within the blueprint documents, it draws a historical parallel from the 1973 reports of an advisory committee and how that translated into future legislation and enforcement. So what they're referring to is the committee, a 1973 committee that created this Records, Computers, and Rights of the Citizens report. And that report, in very short order, was incorporated into further, created the framework for principles. And as we know it, they are the fair information practice principles, notice, choice, access, and security. And in very short order, that made it its way into the first data privacy laws in US, and it had an impact globally into OECD guidelines, Council of Europe conventions, even EU data directives, and they became the framework for federal agencies and their privacy practices as well. So I think just thinking this as a white paper, a standalone white paper would be a mistake.
Mm.
It's coming from the White House. It's coming from the as high as it goes, and we have precedents in history of how this guidance, how these reports, etc., make their way into enforcement and further legislation.
That's a great insight. For our attendees, like I see this on page 9 and also in a later page. So there's a description about a connection to the Fair Information Practice Principles, FIPPs, derived from the 1973 report of an advisory committee to the U.S. Departments of several departments listed there. I think that's what Merv is referring to. So that's I'm kind of really excited because what you're suggesting is that even though this is not enforceable, this might serve as the guidance for any laws that Congress might enact, or even different states or jurisdictions might enact, right? Yeah, if you look at even the New York City bias in hiring or bias audit law for hiring, that there's a lot of resonance with some of the principles in this bill, right?
Exactly. You're already seeing whether it's at local city level, as you mentioned, with New York City already passing a legislation. At state level, we have Illinois, California, etc., who are passing further legislations on this. We have global policy frameworks and legislative work on the table. So there is already a lot of work in progress, and there is a lot of attention and interest in providing these safeguards and turning them into legislation. So I think this blueprint creates that or provides a bit of more force and commitment and support to those legislative actions as well.
So also, if I may add, when I read the blueprint, I see a good amount of discussion on technical guidance, like how these principles can move into practice, right? So it looks like the blueprint is also partially targeted for perhaps even a technical audience, like even in the absence of enforceable regulations, they provide a lot of examples on how to adopt these principles into our machine learning or AI systems as we develop, deploy, monitor these systems, how to kind of adopt these principles. So I even for folks in the audience who may may be wondering whether this is required or not, I would still suggest that it's a great idea to read the blueprint in detail, not just the summary page, but also the entire PDF document. There's a great deal of discussion and a very nice set of references on both technical and legal and some policy related references. So with that said, I'll kind of move on to the next question from our audience. So what industries will the AI Bill of Rights be most immediately impactful? And how do companies demonstrate that they are adhering to or following the spirit of the Bill of Rights instead of just treating it like lip service or checkbox ticking?
Great question. I think some of the looking at the blueprints, looking at the examples, and looking at, as you mentioned, the detail of the document, a lot of the already regulated industries and or the domains where we're talking about historical disadvantages and civil rights protections are already where civil rights protections are already in place. So things like recruitment, like employment, credits, housing, etc. So those are the ones that are clearly healthcare clearly called out in the blueprint, and they also have clear protections. I mean, we're not. I think again, one thing to remember is we're not inventing the wheel from scratch. there are already civil right protections and domains that these protections apply to, where you cannot use certain data to make decisions, where you have to make sure that your outcomes are you need to control your outcomes and check your outcomes, and you're not discriminating against one group or another versus another. So the domains are stay the same. Health and human services, and like I said, employment, housing, credit, insurance, etc. So those are clear. What I would have liked to see, hopefully, we might see it in future enforcement or legislative work, is an inclusion on the law enforcement practices. But I think for me that's a big, one area that is missing. But having said that, I think there's a lot of great deal of implications on certain industries. The second part of the question, I think for organizations who are already involved in the conversations of responsible AI, they already appreciate the safeguards that embedding these principles into their culture and processes. They are already in the process. They understand why this is so important and why it's the right way of doing work, and what that means for their business, customers, and employees, right? So there is already a group of organizations who know that responsible AI is the right thing to do, and it ensures the sustainability of their own business. And I think there are some organizations who might be new to the game or who were kind of on the fence. I think that they need to take these high-level commitments and think of how to embed them into their organizations, kind of looking back those historical parallels and future enforcement and future legislations and future priorities, kind of prepare themselves towards that. For me, it just makes sense. It just makes business sense to use the safeguards in your products and services. But I think expect more to come out in the future, and more focus on this principles, and prepare your organization for future.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think so often I say that even in the absence of regulations or enforceable regulations or laws, it's often in the best interest of a company to proactively adopt these principles, because otherwise, like if as a company, the company is not doing perhaps proactive audits, discovering biases or privacy or other issues, it's fairly easy for people outside the organization to discover those issues. We have seen this not just with say online tech companies, but also with even say lending, right? We have seen examples like the Apple Goldman Sachs credit card issue, where if somebody is really determined, they can discover issues even if it requires maybe some kind of offline or not immediate response. So the other domain where there is a strong business interest is when it comes to monitoring models. So even though, and first of all, it's really insightful to see that this blueprint emphasizes a lot on deployment and monitoring, not just say development of the model, right? Not just development or validation of the model, but also what happens once these data-driven systems are deployed. So when it comes to monitoring, it's always in the best interest of a company to monitor their models, because often various business metrics like revenue, profit, and so forth are tied to the performance of the models. And unless we monitor the models, it's often hard to know whether the models are performing as intended. For the purposes of this blueprint, maybe the emphasis might be more on monitoring for bias and the problematic issues. But if you think of monitoring holistically, there is a lot of value, and it's fully aligned with the business goals of an organization.
I totally agree. By the way, I mean, if you read the blueprint as just just for bias, safeguards around bias and risk, etc., and not think of the whole system.
Mm.
Is it delivering what it's supposed to deliver? Does it continue to deliver, over time with change in data, change in context, change in model, etc.? Does it still continue to deliver? I think not seeing that in the blueprint would be an intentional, avoiding that. It is there for those who want to see. It's already there.
Yeah, yes, I think it relates a lot to both the first and the last principles, right? Like when we say safe and effective systems, if the model degrades over time, even if it's degrading for all users, it's still not desirable, right? Like compared to an alternative world where, say, human experts were providing the decisions. Now, if the AI model is deteriorating over time, still that's not effective. So that kind of goes against the first principle and also touches upon the fifth one as well.
And I again, going back to what I said in general for responsible AI, but as business practice, why would you not look at, kind of monitor on an ongoing basis your system and govern your systems in a robust manner? It's just good business practice. Otherwise, you're not looking. You don't have a long-term vision of your business. You don't have a long-term vision of your systems. You're shooting yourself in the foot. It just makes sense. It's good data science practice. It's good AI practice. Why would you not?
Yeah, and this is compounded by the fact that if you take traditional software, it's when something goes wrong, the software might crash. If you provide an incorrect input, the software might crash. So it's fairly the fact whether the software is working as intended may be somewhat obvious. But when it comes to machine learning models, they're often very forgiving, right? Even if we feed maybe slightly incorrect data, or data which is from a very different distribution as the data that was used for training, the model may still continue to make predictions, just that the quality of those predictions may gradually often degrade over time. So related to that, so I see a question. So what happens from a legal standpoint if the model for a particular transaction violates the Bill of Rights, and the same violation is not detected effectively by monitoring tools? Who will be held accountable? Is it the model owner, as in the business team that sponsored and created the work? Is it the monitoring tool, the company that deployed the tool or developed the tool? Or is it the service provider who may have developed the model as per the business requirements? Do you have thoughts on this?
I have thoughts on many things. But as it relates to this question, I think that the legal basis or legal risk liability as it relates to Bill of Rights, blueprints for an AI Bill of Rights might not be the best reference. I would say there are, as I mentioned, we are not inventing the wheel from scratch. There are already existing civil rights protections and protected classes that are already regulated domains in finance, insurance, employment, housing, etc. So by existing those, by current regulations, your systems should not be discriminating or prioritizing one group in the expense of another. You already should not be making decisions based on protected classes like race, gender, ability, religion, ethnic background, etc. So there are already existing regulations and liability that sits within the systems. Who is responsible is really relevant. Who's responsible and liable is really a question of the domain, especially for regulated industries. So, for example, if you're building or using an AI system for recruitment, if the system is discriminating one group over another, the responsibility and liability sits with the employers. EEOC, as the enforcement agency, pulls the employer aside, and the party that they will be dealing with is the employer, because they are ultimately ones making the decision to use that system. They don't care about vendors. Having said that, in an enforcement manner, they don't care about the vendors. Having said that, you can't create a hiring system, an AI-based hiring system that delivers and creates unfair practices or does not deliver what it says on the tin. You can't say my AI system does this on your website where it doesn't. Then, for example, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, comes in and they deal directly with vendors. So that you are dealing with unfair marketing and unfair trade practices, and they can take enforcement action. So you're not off the hook. Just for example, if you're creating a hiring, hiring system, as an example, you're not off the hook just because you're a vendor. FTC might be coming after you in terms of how you developed and brand that system. EEOC might come after your client, which in turn will impact your business indirectly. So no clients will go through an EEOC engagement and then turn back and continue to use the same system if it has disparate impact or harmful outcomes, right? So by definition, you're all, by the nature of it, and indirectly, you're also regulated by EEOC. So I think looking back away from liability maybe, and thinking more holistically about responsibility and responsible AI might be the better way to do it.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. I think for some of the reasons you mentioned, I often think that even when there are regulations in specific region, right, like the New York City bias in hiring related audit law, if you think of vendors and the entire ecosystem, it's maybe simpler for them to pretend as though this law existed nationwide and provide the same set of tools across the nation, right? So often even a prominent law in one region has a ripple effect and has the effect of making companies and vendors and maybe employers behave in a manner as though the law applied countrywide or even worldwide. So there is a set of questions along the lines of how will the Bill of Rights impact or affect innovation? Could this impact the ability to innovate in the field for the organizations working on AI? And how do we make sure that the innovation is not stifled, and at the same time we have robust controls and guardrails in the form of the Bill of Rights and similar regulations?
That's one of my favorite conversations: innovation versus regulation. They are not versus. I don't see them as opposite and mutually exclusive. In fact, I think such safeguards and regulation impact or affect innovation in a very positive manner. I am of the opinion that principles, regulatory safeguards make for better innovation. For me, it's really easy and lazy to create something, just come up with the concept, put it into a system, in a product or a service, and just launch it into the wild without thinking of the implications or harms or inclusiveness, etc. It's just easy and lazy. However, and it might not be the best product for your target audience as well. It's what you think is best product, but you're not thinking about the implications, accessibility, inclusiveness, possible harms, etc., unintended consequences. Thinking about those, thinking about the safeguards actually make your product, make your services a lot better. It makes for more creative and deliberate product developments and improvements when you actually slow down a bit and think through the consequences and harms and see the bigger picture. So I think, first of all, definitely not on the opposite ends of the spectrum where you have innovation and regulation. They work hand in hand together, and safeguards actually make for better innovation and better products and services.
Yeah, yes, that's I think I resonate a lot with that sentiment, right? Having this kind of well-designed principles or guardrails go a long way in actually enhancing innovation, right? Because all the players have to comply with the spirit of these principles, and having those principles provides a lot of guidance, right? Like what is acceptable, what is not. So related to that,
Krishna, if I may say, I sometimes tease my engineer friends around this. And it's like, oh, are you not creative enough of an engineer to, think through the safeguards and create something better? Are you that lazy? Like I say that fondly to my friends, to my engineer friends, but there's truth to that, really, that it definitely makes for a more deliberative and creative product.
So there is, I see a comment along the lines of, we need something analogous to the FDA, for just like FDA is there for drugs safety and so forth. We need something like an FDA for AI systems. I think that's kind of it resonates a lot with what we are discussing. So related to that, so when this Bill of Rights, the AI Bill of Rights came out, there were even articles along the lines of, is the White House entering a crowded field? There are a number of similar regulations or white papers or blueprints in other regions, right? In the European Union, the Universal Guidelines for Artificial Intelligence, or the OECD AI principles, G20 AI guidelines, and so forth. How do you see the AI Bill of Rights to complement this or even to differ from this?
Oh, great question. And maybe before I compare that landscape, policy and regulatory landscape, kind of again step back and see where this blueprint sits in the US and within the US government. So this is not the first action by the administration. There is actually a continuity despite differences in perspectives and priorities. There's a continuity in terms of AI systems and algorithmic systems across three of the last administrations. So, for example, the Obama White House was the first to talk about harms in data and algorithmic systems and automated systems and its impact on society, its impact on marginalized groups. The previous administration, Trump administration, came up with executive orders on trustworthy AI and kind of put OMB, Office of Management of Budget, in kind of in a coordinating effort for federal agencies as for registry, etc. Registry of AI systems used within these agencies. They also had a bit of a laissez-faire deregulatory approach, so it was more like self-governance, self-assessment. And I think with this administration, we are seeing a continuity of a focus on algorithmic systems and safeguards and trustworthy AI, etc. One thing I like about the blueprints, again, before starting to compare it, is really talk about that underlying theme of fundamental rights, democratic values, and accountability, and also a mention of community impacts. US usually tends to be an individualistic country. A lot of our frameworks and assessment is on how does it impact. And sorry, give me 1 second for the slide to adjust. A lot of the conversation tends to be how is it going to impact the individual rights, etc. One thing that was great for me to see in the blueprint was reference to impacted communities and looking at how these systems might be impacting communities and society at large. I think that's a huge thing. And that really, again, says a lot about Dr. Nelson's and her team's focus and their ability to see the bigger picture. Having said that, what else is out in the landscape, global landscape, and how does this compare? As you mentioned, we have in EU draft EU AI Act, which is a risk-based regulation. It incorporates the Charter of Fundamental Rights of European Union, very similar to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Fundamental Human Rights. It also has references to the existing European data protection and privacy regulations, right? So some of the elements of the blueprint, for example, privacy, legal basis, transparency, etc., are to a certain extent in the existing regulations. And the draft EU AI Act brings this like risk-based regulation. Another parallel is that risk identification, mitigation, and monitoring, ongoing risk monitoring and governance systems. Where it differs, or where the blueprint differs, or sorry, where the EU AI Act differs from the blueprint is, I think the prohibitions and red lines. Obviously, the biggest difference is one is a white paper and policy paper. The other one is a regulation. But there's also a reference in the EU AI Act on certain systems that should not be used at all, like prohibited practices. There is no way that you can use the systems and not infringe upon fundamental rights. So there's fundamental rights or human dignity. So the blueprint has some suggestions around it, but because I think it's like you should not be subject to surveillance at home, or you should not be subject to surveillance at work and at school, etc. So it calls out, but doesn't have like a obviously any regulatory power to it. You mentioned the universal guidelines for AI. This stands actually the first human rights framework for AI. So again, going back to our history, this was created by over 300 researchers, policymakers, and civil society advocates back in 2018. It was announced at the International Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners Conference. And its purpose is to promote transparency and accountability for these systems and ensure that people retain control over the systems that they create. So there is direct, relevance to the blueprints. Pretty much lays out all the principles that are in the blueprints, and then some. So the difference between universal guidelines and the blueprint is universal guidelines incorporates all the principles, but it takes a step forward and calls out on a couple of prohibitions on profiling, like secret profiling systems rather, and unitary scoring, like social scoring in the sense that we talk about social scoring. And then again, it takes another step forward from the blueprint that it actually calls out for a termination obligation. So whereas the blueprint calls out for the possibility to terminate a system if it has unacceptable harms, universal guidelines actually says there is an obligation for whoever is like an affirmative obligation to terminate if human control of the system is no longer possible. So just like knowing that historical trajectory is important, and OECD AI principles, which was announced in 2019, which we also consider as one of the most important policy frameworks, also uses similar principles at the blueprint.
I think there is so much we can continue discussing on this topic, but unfortunately we're running out of time. I would encourage everyone to go and take a look at the fact sheet that accompanies the blueprint as well. There's a web page along with the blueprint where there's a discussion of several other initiatives within the various government agencies which are kind of related to this blueprint. I think along the lines that Merv mentioned, there are a number of existing initiatives that are kind of closely related to this. So I see there are several more questions which unfortunately we do not have time to address today. Merv, do you have any closing thoughts, especially considering that this audience is largely machine learning practitioners, machine learning executives? Do you have thoughts on how the machine learning practitioners should approach this blueprint and more broadly responsible AI?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that final question. I think, like I said, looking at especially safe and effective systems, transparency and explainability principles, you have to see it is there, and like what is in there in terms of data representativeness, data quality, robustness of your ongoing monitoring systems, starting from your objective functions, what you're trying to do with the system, how do you get your data, the quality of your data, what do you do with your data initially and on an ongoing basis, what decisions and trade-offs that you make with your models, with your data, documenting that, having a proper governance system in place is also in the blueprints. If you're looking at implementing into practices, eventual independent evaluations, whether those are audits, etc. All of this tied together, like make your decisions, be careful about your decisions about data and models, document your decisions, document the qualities and limitations of your data and models, have that audit trail, at least for yourself, but for future proofing as well, and have clear roles and responsibilities within your teams, whether that is the ML team, data science team, or the wider up to the board and CEO as well, clear responsibilities on this, and having sort of feedback mechanisms, whether both in your system as well as organization-wide, as these systems are released, or even before during the development. If someone has concerns about some of the decisions that you made, some of the limitations of the data and model, that they can actually flag that without fear of that they might lose their jobs or they might be pulled aside. Have a feedback mechanism for when the system is out in the wild, so people who are impacted by the systems know that they're being subject to the systems, know what the system stands for, how it should function, and can get back to you when it doesn't function as expected, so you can incorporate that to your development cycle again. So the actual practices, like how to implement this, how to operationalize this, are in the blueprint for those who are willing to see. But again, I think for me, at the end of the day, this just makes business sense as well, right? Why would you not?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful summary of the guidance, right? What we all as machine learning researchers, scientists, and practitioners should look forward to. Thank you so much, Merv, for your time and sharing a great deal of insights today. And thanks to all attendees who are there today, and perhaps people who are watching this afterwards. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing many of you in future AI Explained sessions.
Thank you for having me and thank you for the opportunity. Thank
Thank you.